Hello and welcome to another beautiful episode of Mayaani Talks 5 in 1. Mayaani Talks with me, Mega of Mayaani Jewellery. For those of you who are new here, welcome. For those of you who are joining in again, welcome too. Of course, this beautiful space, those who already know, will know that this beautiful space is a space in which we discuss jewelry from a more conscious viewpoint. So, discussing all things jewelry, whether it's what luxury jewelry should look like, who should be the voices behind luxury jewelry, what techniques should we consider to be part of luxury jewelry, what materials form luxury jewelry, what stories and narratives do we want luxury jewelry to hold that we want to pass on to the future generations, what meanings and stories do we want our jewelry to hold. Is it important for our jewelry to be in sync with our life and our values as they are right now? And does celebrating heritage mean we have to stick to rigid rules when it comes to the jewelry we wear? Or should heritage be something that's allowed to evolve so that heritage and the traditions associated with our heritage can remain meaningful, relevant, and just more purposeful in our lives and essentially become something that we live and breathe every single day, rather than feeling a degree of judgment necessary or expectation associated with them, which can happen, I feel personally, when heritage is something that you have to rigidly follow a certain set of rules. Let's say with traditions in particular, for example, when there's a certain set of rules that you have to follow in a certain way, it can feel very rigid, and this rigid structure can therefore detach you from the beautiful experience of being more meaningfully connected to your heritage and to those traditions. So, this is what this beautiful space is about, so that we can go on to make more informed choices moving forward when it comes to our jewelry in general. So, in this particular series of videos, I have been looking at specific forms of bead embroidery across India. We've looked into pearl embellishment, moti bharat, ari, and of course, thread based structure with bead embellishment, because there was no proper name for that technique. And diving into today's beautiful video, there is another beautiful technique which does not have a formal name. So, this was called fine needle beadwork. It's basically it, fine needle beadwork. There is no technical name because, again, fact number one, those of you who know, there are always 5 facts in these videos. Fact number one, this particular technique, fine needle beadwork, did not evolve in institutions. There were no formal certificates you could receive for training in this technique, because this technique arose and was created within women's circles, so within homes and families. And the technique was very much informally passed down, and is to this day informally passed down from mother to daughter, grandmother to daughter, to granddaughter, auntie to niece, from all through all these women's connections, neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend. And women would simply gather together, learn this technique either through observation. Growing up, you might be around a woman who before practiced fine needle beadwork and you've observed it a lot, and so now you're intrigued and you explore it yourself. Or in some cases, women would get together just for an informal, relaxed afternoon, and in that afternoon, one woman would share with another woman her fine needle beadwork embroidery techniques and skills and ideas, and leave that woman to then go on to explore them independently. So there's no formal number of hours or dedicated practice you have to do in this technique. It was very much a technique that just arose in women's circles and was passed down informally from woman to woman. So there is no formal name for this technique. Fact number two, each piece that is created using fine needle beadwork is unique. Now, I know we say that of many handmade pieces, they're all one of a kind to a degree, but the degree to which they're one of a kind does vary depending on the form of artistry used to create that particular piece. So, for example, when pieces are handmade using molds, you're going to get a certain degree of uniformity amongst the pieces that are created. In the case of this beadwork technique, there is no pattern, there are no bead looms, there are no rigid structures. And that's fact number two. There is no bead looms, there are no patterns, there are no rigid structures to this art form. As a result, the artwork that is created using this particular technique is truly one of a kind, is unique. Even the artists themselves would not be able to recreate that piece exactly the same way, because they're not sitting there with a sketch of how many beads they place and where they place them. They simply fluidly, very intuitively create the pieces that are just unfolding in front of their eyes, essentially. The artisan often will not even know what the piece is going to look like necessarily. They'll have thought a little bit about a concept or idea they might want to explore potentially. I do that for a lot of my pieces. I have a bit of a vague idea. In a few cases, I have a real vivid image in my mind because I'm a very visual individual. So I'll actually see the piece in my mind before I go on to create it. Sometimes the colors are exactly where they need to be. Sometimes not all the colors are clear. But as I create the piece, I get a feel for the materials, the flow of the piece that I'm creating, and I start to weave in new elements that perhaps were not in my original idea. But essentially, the artwork is unfolding in front of your eyes. So even the artist who creates these works of art would not necessarily be able to replicate that piece and create an exact replica themselves. They're essentially irreplaceable. They truly are one off pieces that arise out of this fine needle beadwork. Fact number three, when creating these pieces, the person behind the creative process has to always bear in mind three different things. There are three dimensions to their design and this art form that are always front and center in their mind. Those are the structure that is coming to life in front of their eyes. As we mentioned, it's a very intuitive craft form, so there may be no ideas of what the structure is going to be to begin with. So you're just sort of allowing the structure to unfold. You're paying attention to the structure that as it is unfolding. You're paying attention to the tension. Of course, when you're adding these beads on by hand using a needle and thread, you're paying attention to the degree of tension with which you are actually securing the beads into the piece you're creating. And finally, the form, the overall composition, and the overall form that you are bringing to life using these beads and this fine bead and needle beadwork technique. Fact number four, the lack of a formal name. Now, as mentioned before, in thread-based structure with bead embellishment, some of these techniques do not have a formal name. However, I've asked you this question, I'm asking it again. Should the lack of the name for a technique in any way take away from the degree of sophistication associated with the technique? Does lack of a name suddenly mean one technique is not allowed to be considered luxury anymore, or not considered luxury or viewed luxury just because it lacks a name? Or should really the results that are produced through using that technique be more important than the lack or presence of a name? And there are a number of, historically speaking, techniques that have arisen over time, which don't necessarily have specific names to them. But I would argue that the lack of a name does not in any way diminish the right for this technique, just like the thread based structure with bead embellishment technique. I don't think the lack of a name takes away any right fine needle beadwork has to claiming itself as a luxury art form, as a luxury art form that can be used in haute jewelry and haute couture fashion as well. It is in fact used in creating garments, in creating pieces of jewelry, but whether those pieces of jewelry and garment are always viewed at haute couture, that is not always very clear. And I think often they're not viewed that way because potentially of a lack of a name associated with this technique. But should that really in any way mean that these techniques are not allowed the status of luxury that they rightfully earn through the pieces that are created? So I'd love to know. Fact number five, this art form, just as with thread-based structure with bead embellishment, fine needle beadwork is also a form of living heritage. So it's not about preserving tradition. This technique, because there is no formality to it, there are no rigid plans, no rigid designs, no rules to follow when creating using this technique. Because of that freedom to express yourself, essentially, each piece that is created will very much reflect the story of the life of the artisan who's creating it. And that will therefore reflect the times in which that artisan is living. So essentially, what you're creating is living heritage. You are not going to see the same pieces being created over time, especially over large periods of time. You'll actually see heritage evolving, essentially, because what one artist interpreted at one point in time based on the time in which they were living and what the values were in that time and the stories were around that time will evolve to become something slightly different that you now see a few decades, maybe even 100 years later, where an artisan is now weaving with the mindset and the lifestyle and the values of people of that particular time. So it's living heritage. And the beautiful thing about living heritage is that it remains relevant to the lives of the people who are embracing it. When heritage becomes something that we have to follow according to a specific rule book, I personally feel more of us are encouraged to move away from it, to step away from it, because it brings feelings of discomfort if you feel like you're doing it wrong, you know, and if you feel like you don't fully understand it, which typically happens with a lot of our traditions, which of course are a way to celebrate our heritage. Traditions are the root to celebrating heritage. With a lot of traditions, there are rules that exist, there are certain formalities, certain steps that you have to undertake to properly conduct this tradition. But whether everyone knows the full meaning behind each step anymore, that's often not present in my experience. So many traditions growing up were followed by my parents and therefore by me meaninglessly. They were just, this is what we do it like this and this and this and this. But why? The why was always missing. It's like the why got lost because we started to see tradition very rigidly as something you preserve, and you preserve it according to this set of rules. And this is just how it's done. And when that meaning is separated from what it is you're doing, it's something that I feel, you're missing out a lot. It's robbing you of that opportunity to truly connect with your heritage and your ancestry. It's also meaning that when you go on to passing this on to future generations, if you are passing it very much from a here's the rule book, follow it point of view, you're going to come across a generation eventually that goes, well, if this doesn't mean anything to my life, I don't really want to pass it on or celebrate it. So, for us to keep heritage and traditions alive and to keep them out of museums and glass boxes, I would argue that it's very important for us to allow them to evolve. So, I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Do you feel that heritage and traditions should be allowed to, if anything, encouraged to evolve? Is it so important to stick so tightly and so rigidly to a certain set of rules, considering that heritage and traditions have always evolved? What we're following is simply a rule book. At some point in time, people decided this is the rule book, but it's not the original rule book because there is no original rule book, because traditions and heritage have constantly evolved. And if that's the case, are we really even celebrating our heritage and traditions, following the rule book we're following, or just following a specific timeline, rigidly sticking to a particular time period? So, should heritage and tradition be allowed to evolve, as I've already mentioned, considering they've always evolved? So, I would love to know, and I would also love to know from your point of view, just looking at my notes here, at my question, if the key features of haute jewellery are one of a kind, created intuitively as it is in the case of fine needle beadwork and also thread-based thread-based structure with bead embellishment. If those are haute jewellery's values, one of a kind, intuitively created and irreplaceable, then one would argue, are these not all qualities that are present within fine needle beadwork, and should we not therefore consider fine needle beadwork as a form of haute jewelry? Because haute jewelry, by definition, in current times, is very much rigidly tied to this idea of certain materials being used in the process and certain techniques being used in the process as well. But if ultimately the point of haute jewelry is to create a one of a kind piece that's intuitively crafted and irreplaceable, then one would argue that one would question whether we need to stick so rigidly to ideas of haute jewelry looking a certain way and being composed of certain materials and being rigidly created using certain techniques. So I welcome your thoughts on this topic. I will be back with you very soon. Of course, please do hit the like button if you enjoyed today. Feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell as well. I know everyone says it, but it really does mean a lot to us. So I would love for you to help me to spread this content to more people who might be interested in becoming more conscious when it comes to their jewelry, like I am, and like you who are watching are too. Sending you wishes for a beautiful week ahead. Remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought, and I will be back again soon. Bye for now.